Let me be direct with you right now, because nobody else in this media landscape seems to want to be. Putin's land bridge to Crimea, the single most critical supply route sustaining Russia's greatest geopolitical trophy, is under attack, and it is losing. The M14 highway, a 600-kilometer corridor that is quite literally the heartbeat of Russian-occupied Crimea, is now within Ukrainian drone fire control. That means convoys are getting hit. That means supply chains are breaking down. That means the military infrastructure holding together Russia's occupation of the Black Sea Peninsula is being systematically dismantled, not in a blaze of Hollywood glory, but methodically, surgically, and with a precision that should make every defense analyst in Washington sit up straight. This is the story of how Ukraine is strangling Crimea without firing a single major ground assault, and why every American paying attention to where this war is heading needs to understand exactly what is happening right now in Zaporizhzhia. Before we go any further, if you believe that real analysis, not propaganda and not spin, deserves a wider audience, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because this is the kind of reporting that gets buried under celebrity news and political theater, and you being here matters. Let's start with the geography, because you cannot understand this war without understanding the ground beneath it. Crimea is a peninsula jutting into the Black Sea. Russia seized it illegally in 2014, and ever since, the fundamental problem for Moscow has been this: how do you keep a peninsula supplied, armed, and militarily sustained when the country it used to connect to has become your enemy? The answer was infrastructure. Specifically, two lifelines: the Kerch Bridge, a massive crossing linking Crimea to Russian-controlled territory across the strait, and the M14 highway, a 600-kilometer road corridor running through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol straight into the peninsula. These are not just roads and bridges. These are the circulatory system of an occupation. Troops, ammunition, fuel, food, air defense batteries, missile systems, replacement parts, medical supplies, everything Russia needs to maintain its grip on Crimea travels through one of these two routes. Now, here is what most of the Western media is not telling you clearly enough. The Kerch Bridge is damaged. It has been struck multiple times. Its capacity is limited. It is not a reliable, high-volume supply route, which means operationally the M14 land corridor is doing the heavy lifting. It is not one of several options, it is the option. It is the irreplaceable backbone of the Russian occupation, the road that makes the whole thing possible. And right now, Ukraine has brought sections of that road under drone fire control. Let that sink in for a moment. Ukraine is not just threatening this road. It is not just positioning forces near this road. It is actively making this road dangerous, striking convoys, disrupting supply runs, forcing Russian logistics commanders to reroute, delay, and improvise in ways that cascade into real operational consequences at the front line. The Russian military has poured enormous resources into defending this corridor. The 58th Combined Arms Army is there. Motorized infantry divisions are there. VDV airborne divisions, Russia's elite paratroopers, are there, including the 11th VDV Brigade. These are not garrison troops sitting in a quiet backwater. These are frontline warfighters being burned up defending a road. And the Kremlin made a deliberate, conscious decision to deploy them there, even at the cost of weakening its primary offensive push toward Pokrovsk in Donetsk. Read that sentence again and let it register. Russia pulled elite forces away from its main attack to defend a highway. That is not the behavior of a military that is winning. That is the behavior of a military that is terrified of what happens if it loses. So let us talk about what happened in January and February of 2026, because this is where the current phase of this story begins, and it is not the story Russia wanted to tell. Russian forces launched what they framed as successful deep infiltrations into the Zaporizhzhia region, pushing towards settlements like Vasilivka and Novoyakivka. They achieved small gains. They pushed Russian military bloggers, the so-called Z bloggers who function as a kind of crowdsourced Kremlin propaganda network, into a frenzy of celebration. Russia was advancing. The buffer zone was expanding. Zaporizhzhia was going to fall. That was the narrative. And like most Russian military narratives since February 2022, it was wrong. Ukraine counterattacked. The Ukrainian General Staff pulled the 153rd Mechanized Brigade out of Kherson and redeployed it to reinforce the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade along the Stepova-Mali-Shcherbaki axis. Ukrainian Military Intelligence Special Forces, the GUR's most experienced operators, were directed toward the critical Stepnohursk axis. And here is what that tells you if you understand how military decision-making works. When a country sends its best special operations personnel to a particular axis, it is not doing so casually. It is signaling that this terrain matters, that this fight is worth their most capable people, and that the outcome here carries weight beyond the immediate tactical picture. Since January of 2026 alone, Ukraine has recaptured approximately 65 square kilometers of territory in the Zaporizhzhia direction. That is not a skirmish. That is a sustained, grinding reversal of Russian gains by a force that was supposed to be on its back foot. Stepnohursk, a town sitting roughly 25 kilometers south of the city of Zaporizhzhia, has become the focal point of one of the most intense battles on the entire front. Russia needs Stepnohursk. It is a platform for advancing northward toward the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. And taking that city would be a catastrophic psychological and strategic blow for Ukraine. So Russia has poured its elite units into this fight. VDV brigades, Marine Corps units hastily redirected from the Donetsk front, the works. And after 7 months of fighting, Russia has failed to meaningfully advance. Ukrainian forces have made significant progress inside Stepnohursk itself, pushing Russian positions back in the town's center and northern sectors. The counterattack and consolidate cycle that Ukrainian commanders have refined over 3 years of brutal warfare is working. Russia throws everything it has at Stepnohursk, and Ukraine absorbs it, pushes back, consolidates, and holds. The Russian offensive capacity in Zaporizhzhia is visibly declining. The momentum has shifted, and the evidence for that is undeniable. But here is where this story becomes genuinely fascinating from a military perspective, and here is where you start to understand that Ukraine is fighting this war on a completely different intellectual level than its opponent. While Russia was focused on Stepnohursk, while its intelligence apparatus was watching the obvious front line, Ukraine was preparing something else, something secret, something surgical, and something that succeeded precisely because Russia's entire attention was pointed in the wrong direction. According to detailed reporting by the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine launched a significant counteroffensive operation at the intersection of the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, a large-scale operation that was kept so tightly classified that in a brigade of over 2,000 soldiers, only about 10 people knew it was coming. 10 people. In a military force of thousands, that is operational security at a level that most professional armies in the world struggle to achieve. And it is worth pausing on why that matters so much in this particular war. Because this is not the wars of the 20th century. This is not a conflict where you can mass your forces behind a ridgeline and move under the cover of darkness and hope the enemy does not notice. Every field, every road, every trench in this war is being watched by drones. Russian drones, Ukrainian drones, commercial satellites, military reconnaissance systems. The battlefield is transparent in a way that no previous generation of soldiers has ever experienced. And in that environment, the ability to conceal intent, not just movement, but purpose, not just troops, but plan, is perhaps the single most decisive military advantage that exists. Ukraine achieved that concealment. Before the infantry moved a single step, Ukrainian forces spent weeks systematically neutralizing Russian artillery. Approximately 150 Russian artillery units were identified in a roughly 30-kilometer stretch between Holyapol and Berehov. Those guns were targeted and suppressed before the ground assault began. Artillery strikes and drone operations worked in coordinated sequences. Even the weather cooperated. Fog rolled in, concealing Ukrainian movements and positions from overhead observation. And then the attack happened, and Russian commanders discovered something they were not prepared for: Ukrainian assault units materializing behind Russian lines. Not at the front, behind it. According to Ukrainian commanders, Russian forces believed the initiative was still theirs until attacking units appeared in their rear areas. That is not just a tactical success. That is an intelligence failure of the first order on Russia's part. Russia had drones in the sky. Russia had surveillance assets watching that front. And it still did not see what was coming. Because visibility is not understanding, and Ukraine has learned to exploit that gap with devastating effect. Now, the ground gains in Zaporizhzhia matter, but let me be absolutely clear about what the real strategic story here is, because this is the part that has Russian military bloggers openly panicking, and it is the part that deserves your full attention. The real blow Ukraine is striking is not on the front line. It is 100 kilometers behind it. Ukrainian defense forces have established fire control over sections of the Taganrog-Jankoy Highway, the M14, the main land corridor leading to occupied Crimea. And when military analysts use the phrase fire control, they mean something very specific. They do not mean Ukraine has physically occupied the road. They mean Ukraine has made the road dangerous. They mean convoys are being struck. They mean drivers know that traveling that route puts them in the crosshairs of a drone. They mean Russian logistics officers have to plan every convoy as if it is a combat mission rather than a routine supply run. And the operational effect of that, the compounding, cascading effect across days and weeks and months, is absolutely devastating. Think about what it means when every truck driver knows his vehicle might be targeted. Think about what it means when fuel shipments are delayed, when ammunition runs arrive incomplete, when air defense batteries cannot be repositioned quickly because the roads are too dangerous to move convoys on openly. Every delayed truck translates directly into less fuel at the front, fewer artillery rounds for Russian gun crews, less flexibility for commanders trying to plan and execute operations. The logistics network does not need to be physically destroyed to collapse operationally. It just needs to be disrupted enough, often enough, to degrade the tempo of everything downstream. And Ukraine is achieving exactly that, at scale, using drones that cost a few $1,000s to target systems and convoys worth millions. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, confirmed in its May 9th assessment that Ukrainian forces are conducting effective strikes more than 100 kilometers deep into areas that Russia had previously considered safe rear territory. 100 kilometers. That means the Russian concept of a secure rear, a protected zone where logistics can flow freely, where troops can rest and rotate, where equipment can be maintained and staged. That concept no longer exists in southern Ukraine. It has been eliminated by Ukrainian drone capability. And then, on the night of May 5th to 6th, Ukraine demonstrated exactly what it intends to do to the far end of that corridor. Ukrainian drone strikes hit targets near Jankoy in occupied Crimea. An S-400 launcher, a premier Russian air defense system worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was struck. 2 mobile fire group vehicles were destroyed. 1 Russian soldier was killed and 10 were wounded at that location. But the main strike targeted the Jankoy railway station, and this is where the strategic picture becomes unmistakably clear. 5 Russian soldiers killed, 5 wounded, a locomotive destroyed, multiple freight cars damaged. Jankoy is not just a train station. It is the central distribution hub of Crimea's entire railway network. The majority of rail traffic coming from the Russian mainland via the Kerch Bridge gets sorted and routed through Jankoy to Sevastopol, to Simferopol, to coastal military bases in the south. Destroy the junction and you paralyze the distribution. Even a single destroyed locomotive causes delays that cascade for days. Ukraine is not just hitting the road to Crimea. It is hitting the point where the road ends. If you are getting the picture of a methodical, patient, and strategically sophisticated campaign, you should be, because what Ukraine is executing right now in the Zaporizhzhia-Crimea theater is a textbook blockade strategy, and it is being implemented with a precision and discipline that is genuinely remarkable for a country fighting a full-scale war of survival with limited resources. The model being applied here is one that retired U.S. General Ben Hodges, one of the most respected voices in Western strategic analysis, has been advocating for months. It operates in 3 phases. Phase 1, isolation. Cut the supply lines. Make the logistics untenable. Degrade the enemy's ability to sustain its forces. Phase 2, make the situation militarily and economically unacceptable. Drive up costs, increase losses, multiply the burden on the Kremlin's already strained defense budget. Phase 3, liberation, which becomes increasingly inevitable once phases 1 and 2 have done their work. General Hodges stated in April 2026 that there is no need for a frontal assault on Crimea. Cut off the logistics and let time take care of the rest. Analysts at ISW and the Atlantic Council have endorsed this framework, and for good reason. A direct ground assault on Crimea risks enormous Ukrainian casualties, enormous geopolitical escalation, and the very real possibility that Putin, cornered and desperate, reaches for options no one wants to contemplate. But logistical isolation? Logistical isolation is slow, grinding, economically devastating for Russia, and carries none of those escalatory risks. And Ukraine is executing it right now. This is the right moment to pause and remind you. If this analysis is valuable to you, share it right now. Send it to someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in this war beyond the headlines. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below telling me what you think the breaking point is for Russia in Crimea. Because your engagement keeps this kind of analysis alive, and this conversation matters. Consider the economic dimension of what is happening. Russia's military presence in Crimea is extraordinarily expensive. Air defense systems require continuous maintenance, staffing, and resupply. The Black Sea Fleet, based in Sevastopol, requires fuel, munitions, and personnel rotations. Ground forces across the peninsula need to be sustained indefinitely. Infrastructure, military and civilian, requires constant upkeep. All of that costs money, and Russia is paying that bill while simultaneously funding a full-scale land war across a 1,000-kilometer front. Every Ukrainian drone strike adds to that bill. Damaged equipment must be repaired or replaced. Alternative supply routes must be established, and they are more expensive than the ones being disrupted. Additional electronic warfare assets must be deployed to protect every convoy, which means those assets cannot be used elsewhere. Resources consumed protecting supply lines cannot be directed toward offensive operations. Ukraine is imposing costs of millions of dollars on Russia using drones that cost a few $1,000s each. The asymmetry is staggering, and it favors Ukraine in every engagement. The Hornet drones used by Ukrainian forces are penetrating deep behind the front lines, targeting fuel tankers, supply convoys, strategic transportation routes. The T-0509 highway, once a fully secure Russian rear area route, is now another vulnerable artery. And former militant commander Igor Girkin, no friend of Ukraine, a man who helped launch this war in 2014, is among those noting publicly that Russia cannot keep pace with this new generation of drone warfare. When your own former warlords are saying you are losing the drone war, the situation is genuinely dire. Now let us talk about what all of this means in the broader context, because this is where it stops being a purely military story and starts being something that affects America's strategic interests directly. And yes, it affects yours, even if Zaporizhzhia feels like it is a world away from your life. Putin has recently shifted his public rhetoric. He has made statements suggesting the war is nearing its conclusion. Western media has covered these statements with a mixture of cautious optimism and credulity that makes any serious analyst want to throw something at the television. Because here is what Putin's peace rhetoric actually means when you strip away the diplomatic language and look at the battlefield facts. It means Russia's offensive momentum has stalled. It means casualties are at levels the Kremlin is struggling to absorb and conceal. It means Ukraine's deep strike capability is threatening infrastructure inside Russia itself, oil refineries, military airfields, naval vessels that Moscow believed were safely beyond reach. And it means the pressure on the M14 land bridge, the pressure on Crimea's supply lines, is forcing Putin to calculate whether this war is still winnable at a price he can politically survive. But, and this is the critical point that should alarm every American policymaker, tone is not policy. Words are not action. Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov has stated explicitly that progress in the peace process will stall unless Ukraine withdraws from the Donbass. Read that clearly for what it is. Russia is demanding at the negotiating table territory it has not fully seized by force on the battlefield. It is demanding diplomatic legitimization of a military occupation that its military cannot fully consolidate. And that tells you everything you need to know about who actually holds the leverage in this war right now. If Russia were genuinely dominant, if the momentum were truly on Moscow's side, Ukraine would have no cards to play at a negotiating table. Russia would simply continue advancing until it achieved its objectives. The fact that Putin is talking about peace while his battlefield position is deteriorating tells you that the pressure Ukraine is applying is working. The strategic isolation of Crimea is working. The drone campaign against M14 is working, and the Kremlin knows it. What should concern every American paying attention is the gap between the narrative and the reality. The narrative are pushed by Russian state media, amplified by certain Western commentators who should know better, is that Russia is winning, that Ukraine is exhausted, that the West should pressure Kyiv to accept territorial concessions and end this thing. The reality, visible on the ground in Zaporizhia, measurable in Russian military blogger panic posts, confirmed by ISW assessments, demonstrated by Ukrainian strikes 1,700 kilometers inside Russian territory at the Shagol airfield in Chelyabinsk, is that Russia is under pressure it did not anticipate and cannot fully counter. Ukrainian drones struck Su-57 and Su-34 aircraft at that airfield. A Karakurt-class missile ship was struck at Primorsko-Akhtarsk. Distance no longer protects Russian assets. Ukraine's reach has extended to depths that fundamentally alter the strategic calculus of this war. And the question every American leader and every American voter should be asking is this: at what cost are we going to demand Ukraine accept a settlement that locks in Russian gains made through illegal invasion? Because the answer to that question determines not just the future of Ukraine, but the future of the international rules-based order that American power and American security have depended on for 8 decades. Russia is also dealing with something that does not get enough attention in the Western press: the domestic political fallout of the Crimea logistics story. Among the Russian public, or at least the portions of it with access to anything beyond state television, the narrative that everything is under control is fracking under the pressure of reality. Z-bloggers, the Kremlin's own informal propaganda infrastructure, are openly discussing logistical paralysis, security vulnerabilities in the rear, the inadequacy of Russian electronic warfare systems against Ukrainian drones. These are not Ukrainian sources making these claims. These are Russian sources speaking to Russian audiences, admitting that the rear is not secure, that convoys are being hit, that the land bridge to Crimea is no longer safe. Combined with war fatigue that is now approaching 3 years, combined with economic pressure from sanctions and oil price volatility, combined with the pervasive fear of another wave of mobilization, this represents a genuinely dangerous cocktail for the Putin regime's domestic stability. And Ukraine, to its immense credit, understands all of this. The 800,000 Russian citizens who have settled in Crimea since 2014 are living with a growing sense of insecurity that no amount of state media cheerleading can fully suppress. Water shortages on the peninsula have been an ongoing crisis. Air defense capabilities are being progressively eroded by Ukrainian strikes. The supply pipeline is being squeezed, and the knowledge, spreading through social media, through Z-blogger panic posts, through conversations that the FSB cannot fully monitor or suppress, that the land bridge is under threat, is doing psychological work that no Ukrainian missile strike could accomplish alone. The question for Crimea is no longer whether it can be reclaimed. The question is how much longer Russia can hold it at a cost that the Russian state and the Russian public are willing to pay. Here is the bottom line, and I want you to hear this clearly, because this is the part that the mainstream narrative consistently fails to deliver. What Ukraine is doing right now in Zaporizhia and along the M14 corridor is not a desperate last stand. It is not the flailing of an exhausted military scraping the barrel. It is a sophisticated, coordinated, and strategically coherent campaign to strangle Crimea without firing a shot at its beaches. And it is working. The land bridge is bleeding. The Jankoy Junction has been hit. The M14 is under fire control. The Tu-509 is under drone surveillance. The Kerch Bridge, already damaged multiple times, already at limited capacity, stands as the last remaining major supply route, and Ukraine has explicitly stated its intention to strike it when the operational moment arrives. Russia's elite VDV units in Zaporizhzhia are experiencing supply delays that degrade their combat effectiveness. The redeployment of those units from the Donetsk front has weakened Russia's main offensive push toward Pokrovsk. The Kremlin is robbing Peter to pay Paul across a 1,000-kilometer front and running out of Peters. The three-phase blockade model, isolation, making the situation untenable, and final liberation, is not theoretical anymore. It is active. It is measurable. And phase one is delivering results that should be reshaping the conversation in every Western capital about what the end game of this war actually looks like. This is not a stalemate. This is not a frozen conflict inching toward an inevitable Russian triumph. This is a war in which one side is applying asymmetric pressure with increasing sophistication, and one side is losing strategic assets it cannot easily replace, at costs it cannot easily absorb, in a theater it cannot afford to lose. Putin took Crimea in 2014 in 11 days. The bill for that illegal seizure has been mounting ever since. And right now, in 2026, Ukraine is working methodically, deliberately, and with growing strategic clarity to push that bill to a number that even the Kremlin cannot pay. The road to Crimea is breaking down. The occupation is costing more than Russia can sustain. And the world, including every American who thinks this war is someone else's problem, is watching the shape of the future being decided in the skies above the M14 highway and the railway yards of Jankoy. Subscribe right now if you are not already, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to hear the truth about what is actually happening in this war. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, I respond to them, and your perspective on this matters, because this is not just Ukraine's fight. The principles at stake, sovereignty, international law, the right of nations to exist without being consumed by their neighbors, those are American principles too. And what happens on that highway in southern Ukraine is going to echo in ways that reach far beyond its borders. Stay awake, stay informed, and do not let anyone tell you this war does not matter.